Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the English Reformation in our continuing study of the history of Christianity. We've already looked, if you've been with us, at the beginning of the Reformation, Martin Luther in Germany, Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland. We're going to see this time William Tyndale. He's going to be in England. But to really get a sense of what's going on in England, we have to backtrack to the 1400s. The 1400s, beginning in 1457, you have a civil war in England between two competing ruling houses, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. It's called the War of the Roses. The symbols of the colors of the roses symbolize each of these houses. You have, on the one hand, with is representing by the red rose, you have Henry VII against Richard III. Remember how that Shakespeare writes a play about Richard III, where at one point he's calling out "My kingdom" for a horse, and no horse is forthcoming, and he is slain on the battlefield. As a result of Richard now being slain, you have Henry VII bringing these two houses together by taking in marriage Elizabeth. She's from the House of Lancaster, and so we have these two houses that are going to come together, and they will produce an heir. So notice in England we'll have Henry VII and Elizabeth. They will have two sons. One is named Arthur. It's a great name for a king. And then the younger son will be Henry VIII. And they are going to seek to enter into an alliance with Spain. Spain is the up and coming ruler. They're about to discover, through Columbus, the Americas. And so Ferdinand and Isabella, they have a daughter by the name of Catherine of Aragon. And so Catherine will be joined in marriage to Arthur, and it looks like it's going to be great, but I don't know if it was on their wedding night or a few days later. We're not exactly sure the time frame, but Arthur dies. And so he has died, and there goes the alliance. And they say, well, no, we can retrieve this. We have a younger son. He can take Catherine in marriage. Now, to marry the widow of your brother is rather odd. And it's just not something that was done. But they say, well, there was this thing in the Old Testament, the levirate marriage, remember, where if a woman died and her husband, not a woman, husband died, and they had not had a child, then you could have one of the brothers come and stand in for the dead husband and have a child by her. Now, that wasn't commonly practiced in Europe because there was another law that said it was improper for you to take your brother's wife. So they had two competing issues, and so what they're going to do, they're going to seek a special dispensation from the papacy, and the Pope will give them a special dispensation that in this case, because of circumstances, it's okay for Henry VIII to marry Catherine of Aragon, and they do. And eventually, they're going to have a child. They're going to have a child, a girl by the name of Mary. That's all fine, well, and good, but they need a male child because so far there had been no uncontested queens ruling by themselves. The throne wouldn't pass over to a daughter; it needed to pass over to a son. At least that's the way it was felt at the time. And so he's seeking to have more children, and she is able to have children, but none survive infancy. And after a while, she's getting older, and we're beginning to have an issue because there is no issue. There's no male issue. There's no male child. Now, meanwhile, while this is all going on, you have William Tyndale. He is a scholar, a professor, and he translates the Bible into English. His translation, the Tyndale Bible, we actually still have copies of that today. We're looking at a page from John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word actually says, and God was that Word. He actually follows the word order in the Greek. Doesn't mean quite the same thing. Our present day translations are a little bit better, a little clearer. I would go with our present day translations. And you can understand this, but you can also see how the English language has gone through some changes. You can still recognize it as English. It's not like reading Spanish or Greek or something like that. But the English language has obviously changed. Now he translates the Bible into English, and he's also saying some other things like, um, we have our authority in the scriptures, and they ought to inform us, and we ought to be reading the Lord's word in our common language and learning it. And he's living in a day and age where they might actually persecute and even condemn somebody for reciting the Lord's Prayer not in its proper Latin, but in English, because the language of scholarship and the quote unquote holy language of the day was considered by the Roman Catholic Church to be Latin. And so he has stepped outside the bounds of good Roman Catholic theology in bringing about this translation and in the other teachings that he's endorsing. So he is condemned as a heretic. He is forced to flee to the continent. For a time, he's in Europe, printing Bibles, as I might add. He is finally arrested in Brussels, and he is condemned as a heretic, and he is burned at the stake. And his last words are, "Lord, please open the eyes of the King of England." And the British Reformation is indeed going to come through the monarchs. I'm not saying they're going to become reformed. Remember, Henry VIII, he's not just Roman Catholic. He's actually written a paper at this point that was against Martin Luther, condemning Martin. I don't know if he penned. He probably got somebody to ghostwrite it for him. But Henry VIII had written against the Reformation and wanted no part of the Reformation, but he is having an issue with his wife not being able to have any more children, especially to produce a male heir. And so he goes to his chancellor, Cardinal Wolsey, who notices both holding a position in the church, but also is really the second most powerful man. Some would argue that maybe as powerful as Henry VIII, certainly as rich as he had used his position to amass wealth for himself. And so he sends Wolsey on a mission to try to seek a resolution um, in the marriage of Henry VIII. Can we get, well, if not a divorce, can we at least get an annulment? Remember, in a divorce, that's where saying, okay, somehow this isn't working, we're going to divorce your spouse. In an annulment, what you're technically saying is that we haven't had any sort of sexuality together. We never consummated the marriage. Well, they can't claim that because they've already had a daughter. They've already had Mary, and a number of other children that were not able to survive infancy, but that's what the claim is going to be. And Wolsey has the deck stacked against him. He's going to go to the Roman Catholic Church. He's going to go to the Pope. And meanwhile, what has happened? Just want to give you a little bit more here. Catherine of Aragon had a sister, Johanna, who was married to Philip I of Spain. So he's meanwhile going to be the King of Spain. But they have a child, Charles V, who is the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, the same man who was at the Diet of Worms, condemning Luther as a heretic. Well, now what's taken place? He's the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and he has had his falling out with people in Italy and with the Pope, and he has gone down to Italy and captured the Vatican in the year 1527. And so here's Henry VIII seeking a annulment of his marriage to the aunt of Charles V, when Charles V has captured the Vatican and the Pope is virtually his prisoner down in Italy. That's just not going to fly. So Wolsey does his best, but he is finally removed by Henry VIII. Look, you weren't working hard enough. You didn't do it. You didn't bring about what I wanted. And so Thomas More now becomes the new chancellor. Also, he's also part of the Roman Catholic Church. And Henry VIII says, "I know what we need to do. We need to break off from the Church of Rome. We need to break off from the Roman Catholic Church, and we will have just the Church of England. We'll call it the Anglican Church, and I will be the head of the church. And then, whoever I appoint to be the archbishop will just do what I say, and I'll get my annulment, and things will be fine." And Thomas More cannot go along with that. He refuses to sign on, and so he's going to be actually put to death as well. Being around Henry, if you were not successful, could be hazardous to your life. Well, Henry VIII then, he's seeking a annulment or divorce. It's going to be an annulment instead of a divorce from his wife. And in doing so, he will break away from he'll break the church away from Rome. But he's not saying we're now reformed. Remember, he's completely against Martin Luther and the Reformation, at least at this point. Um, but he is breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church, and there will be people in England that will be using this as an excuse. Well, we're no longer Roman Catholic. What else is there? Let's go in the direction of the Reformation. And so the church will be, whether it wants to or not, whether Henry wants it to or not, it's going to begin moving in that direction. But he's continuing to follow Roman Catholic forms of worship. Nothing has changed from the outside. What people are believing, that's changing. But from the outside, nothing big is changing. And in this time, remember how we had Tyndale, who had translated the Bible into English, and that translation, as well as Tyndale, had been condemned. You have Matthew Coverdale, who had been a friend of Tyndale's, and he translates the Bible into English, the Coverdale Bible, under the auspices of King Henry, but that Coverdale Bible looks remarkably like the Tyndale Bible. He does put some changes. I'm not accusing him of plagiarizing, but he borrows heavily from the studies of his friend, and I think Tyndale's legacy lives on in the Coverdale Bible. Now, he is going to get his divorce. Catherine of Aragon will be divorced. Remember, she had been the queen, and that means that her daughter will no longer be the next heir automatically. And Henry VIII already had a, uh, a replacement standing in the wings. In fact, by the time they actually go through a secret marriage initially, Anne of Boleyn, and she's already pregnant, but she's going to be executed. So it's going to be divorce, executed, and then he'll take Jane Seymour. She will die. Next, we'll have Anne of Cleves. It's interesting. Thomas Cromwell, still another chancellor, helps to organize. He plays matchmaker and helps to organize this. But there will be a divorce here as well. And then Catherine Howard will be executed. And finally, you have Catherine Parr. Notice 6 different wives. They go divorce, executed, died, divorce, executed, survived. And finally, the reason she survives is because Henry VIII, he actually dies. Now, when he dies, he has left 3 children. There was Catherine of Aragon, and Mary I. We'll get to know her later on as Bloody Mary, so I put that in parentheses, or in quotation marks. Anne of Boleyn had given birth to a daughter before she was executed, and that's Elizabeth. And then finally, Jane Seymour, not the modern day actress, but the queen back then, gave birth to a child that managed to survive even though he was sickly, and he was Edward VI. And so when Henry VIII dies, he does have a male to follow him, the young Edward VI. He's around 9 years old, just a boy, but at least he's a male child. Now, Edward VI then comes to the throne. He's the son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. And he had been tutored in Reformed theology under the influence of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who himself was embracing Reformed theology, but doing this sort of undercover. And so undercover, Edward VI had grown up believing that salvation is by grace through faith, and that the Bible ought to be our only authority. And yes, you're going to be a king and you'll have authority, but the Bible is the greater authority. And he actually wrote a paper describing the Pope as the Antichrist. I suspect he had some help, but he was still pretty young. Um, and remember, Henry VIII had been saying, let's not be reformed, but if you want to think of the Pope as the Antichrist, that's helpful to my cause. And so that had gone with the flow. He becomes king, as I said, about the age of 9, and the prohibitions that were already in place against reading the scriptures in the common language, those are repealed. From now on, it's okay. You're encouraged to read the Bible in your own language. That's a big thing for the Reformation. That's going to be a big thing in England. He allows now the marriage of priests, overturning the formal laws of the celibacy of the priesthood. And the prayer book is rewritten to reflect Protestant theology. And so former edicts of the king that were saying, no, we have to hold us at transubstantiation. Actually, Henry VIII had passed something like that in what was called the Six Articles, things that were affirming Roman Catholic theology, if not the Roman Catholic Church. Those are now replaced, and new ordinances are passed that are friendly to the Reformation. He is described by the reformers as a new Josiah. Remember how Josiah had come to the throne very, very young, but from the outset had said, no, we're going to follow the Lord, and Edward VI is seen in a similar light. They come out with 42 articles replacing the six that were decidedly Roman Catholic in their theology. These 42 articles are decidedly Reformed in their theology. They are authored by Cranmer, and it's a Reformed doctrinal statement which is turning the Kingdom of England into a Reformed kingdom. Now, Henry VI dies. He's still in his teens, late teens, and he dies of pneumonia. He'd always been rather sickly. And he named, on his deathbed, he names his cousin, Jane Grey, as his successor. So Lady Jane Grey, she'd been the cousin named as his successor. She's Protestant. What Edward is trying to do is advance the Protestant cause, even as he dies. She's named queen, but she only lasts for 9 days as queen. And the Privy Council, we would think of it as the Parliament, sort of, turns instead to Mary I, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Remember, she had been actually a daughter of Henry VIII, through that marriage that had been annulled. And they say, no, we want you to be queen instead. And so Lady Jane Grey is going to be executed. Will have reigned for a total of 9 days, and she's going to die off with her head. And now Mary I will become the queen. She is going to get the nickname Bloody Mary. She's the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. She is decidedly Roman Catholic. Remember, the Pope had said, yes, I'm going to allow this special dispensation for your mother and your father to be married, and had not authorized a annulment or a divorce. And that's the way, that's her story, and she's sticking to it. And so she begins an intense persecution of those that had moved England into the direction of Reformed theology, of the reformers. Some of those that are going to come under her sword, Thomas Cranmer, he's the Archbishop of Canterbury, had instituted those reforms, reforms such as having worship in English and in a language that people can hear and understand, having that Book of Common Prayer, recognizing the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, the bread and the wine, as the spiritual presence. That's language right out of Calvin. Not saying that, denying transubstantiation where the bread and the wine become literally the body and blood of Jesus, or even the Lutheran idea of where, yes, he's with the elements, but actually this is a spiritual presence. This is the way Calvin described it. And he's going to be arrested and tortured into signing a confession of recantation. He's going to recant his view. That will not stop him from going to be burned alive. And as they set him on fire, he will take the hand that signed the paper of recantation and he'll thrust that into flame, denouncing his recantation, saying, no, that hand deserves to be burned first. Now, so he dies. Not only does he, a number of other Reformation leaders in England, Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, pictured in this wood carving. This is sort of it's a drawing that's based on the wood carving. And as they are being stake, one says to the other, Latimer says to Ridley, be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out. Now, the good news is that Bloody Mary doesn't live very long. After a few years, she dies, and now Queen Elizabeth, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, she now is recognized as queen. It was really up in the air whether she was going to be put to death by Bloody Mary, but she wasn't. And so she now becomes the queen, and she is given the title because Henry VIII had taken the title head of the church. Well, that doesn't really sound too well for a woman to be the head of the church. So she's going to take the title supreme governor of the church. That's like a little bit less. But she will be the monarch. She will reign. And she's Protestant, but seeking to find a middle way between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, to say, look, we have Roman Catholic subjects, we have Reformed subjects, and I'm queen over all of it, and we're going to try to find a way to have peace within the church. But remember, this is a state church, so it's not like you can have two different denominations. So they're going to come out with 39 articles, not the 42, but the 39, which will still be in the direction of that middle way. They won't be quite so reformed, but they will decidedly not be Roman Catholic in their nature. And so, what's going to bind them together? She will pass the Act of Uniformity that they will have worship together, and they will have a book of common prayer. To this day, if you look at the Anglican Church, the Church of England, it's still there today. And you have American counterparts. You don't call it the Church of England here or the Anglican Church here. We call it the Episcopal Church, but it's the same basic church. What binds them together? You have people reflecting that are Roman Catholics in everything but except having a pope and being connected to Rome. And then there are folks there that are Reformed in their outlook and everything in between. What binds them together is a book of common prayer. And I think if you're going to have something that binds people together, that's not a bad thing. I'm rather fond of that idea. So their liturgy and their book of common prayer. So this was a church that taught and prayed like a Protestant, but with regards to their worship, the way they looked from the outside looking in, it looked Catholic. It had all the candles and the all sorts of things that outwardly look the robe, what I think of as the royal robes, um, looked like their Roman Catholic forefathers. Now, what you have then in England is this tension. On the one hand, you'd had a growing Puritan movement, those that wanted to purify the church from those Roman Catholic, from its Roman Catholic past, and you had those that were still basically Roman Catholic, and in the middle, you have sort of the Anglican Church trying to pull both of these together that are actually at odds with each other, two different ideologies. And so you have this issue taking place in England during this time. In addition to this, you have some political issues. Political issues are Spain to the south. You had Scotland, which allied with France. If you remember that movie, Braveheart. Now, that was from a much earlier era, but it sort of reflects this idea where there was not a lot of love lost between the Scotch and the English. And so Scotland, their traditional allies were with France, and the Scotland Presbyterians rebel against Mary of Guise from France. Remember, she was the French queen. We saw her in the days of John Knox. And Elizabeth, just because of the politics, she's going to side with the reformers. So, but again, she still has Roman Catholic subjects. There is actually an attempt to assassinate Elizabeth that is traced back to some Roman Catholics, and so that really presents an issue for the Roman Catholic subjects there. And so she's pushed more and more to side with the reformers. In France, meanwhile, you have a Calvinistic movement, what you call them in France. You don't call them Calvinists. I think Calvin would have shuddered at that name, to name people after himself. Um, but instead, they were described as Huguenots. And so that's just another way of saying Calvinists, followers of Calvin and his ideology, and specifically of his Reformed teachings that are in France. And we're going to come back and look at what's going on in France in a future class, but they're having some big issues, and the Huguenots are being persecuted, heavily persecuted. Now, next you have Mary, Queen of Scots, who is the daughter of Mary of Guise. She's also Roman Catholic and wants to take for herself a Roman Catholic husband. She finally is married to Henry Stuart and has James, their child, but then he is assassinated. he's murdered, and she is implicated. Now, whether I'm not going to try to judge the merits of the case, but she's accused because within 5 days of his murder, she's ready to take on a new husband. You say, and her new husband to be is one of those that was a suspect in the murder. So that doesn't look very positive for her. So she's suspected, and she flees to England, and Elizabeth imprisons her because, again, there's, Elizabeth is on the opposite side of France, so they're not going to be on the same side. Ultimately, she's going to be executed, and then you have, meanwhile, Spain. Remember Philip II of Spain? He's going to come with his Spanish Armada. He's coming up against England. You say, well, what's he got to do with this? Philip II had been married to Queen Mary, Bloody Mary, and now she has died, and there have been no children between them. But he's saying, my wife was the queen, and that means that I should be the king, and so I'm the rightful king of England, and so I'm coming with my Spanish Armada to come and take over. And in the ensuing battle, the Spanish Armada was huge. It was so much bigger than the English Navy. At one point, the British take a few of their ships, 5 or 6 ships, set them on fire, and sail them into the Spanish Armada, and actually catch a few of the Spanish ships on fire. They lose the battle, but they still have their fleet intact. Following the battle, he continues on through the channel, and the plan is to circle the British Isles and either find a better landing spot or else come back to Spain. And instead, they run into a unseasonal hurricane. You know how hurricanes typically go up the coast of the Americas. I live in South Florida, so we see them all the time. But then sometimes they'll go out in the Atlantic, and when they're out in the Atlantic, the storm might continue. And this one made it all the way back to England. And so as this hurricane is hitting England, it's the Armada's there and is sunk, and very few ships make it back. He says, I sent the Armada against men, not God's wind and waves. And so this is seen, at least by Philip II, and perhaps by others, as an act of God in saving England and saving this new Protestant country. So we have the Spanish Armada sunk. We have Queen Elizabeth, a long reign. She never does take a husband. She never does have any children. In fact, she gets the nickname the Virgin Queen, and we actually have a state in the United States, 2 states for that matter, that are named after her. Virginia is named after the quote unquote Virgin Queen. And after she dies, we're going to have a new king that's going to come from a new family, King James. And he will authorize a new translation to be made, the King James Version. And we'll see that in a future class. But first we have to go to France. And so next we'll be looking at France and its Huguenots.